And anticipation is building here at Buckingham Palace with less than 2 days to go before Charles is crowned king. But for his wife and rock Camilla, Saturday will cement a mighty transformation from world's most hated second women to Queen of the United Kingdom.
The judge stopped turning pages. For several seconds, nothing moved inside the courtroom. Charles sat rigidly, staring toward the bench as the folder remained open beneath the judge's hand. Then the judge looked down at one particular page and paused again. It was not the amount of money that appeared to matter. It was the date. According to the account at the center of this story, that date pointed to preparations that had begun before Charles had ever been told they existed. The next words were delivered without drama. That was what made them so unsettling. The judge reportedly explained that the documents appeared to describe contingency arrangements involving royal responsibilities, financial decisions, and the distribution of influence if Charles's position became unstable. But one detail stood apart from everything else. The planning allegedly contemplated a future in which Charles himself might no longer be at the center of those decisions. The room seemed to shrink around him. Charles did not immediately react. He looked toward the advisors nearby, waiting for someone to correct what he had just heard. No one did. His expression hardened, then changed again, as if disbelief was giving way to a question he had never expected to ask inside a courtroom. What had Camilla been preparing behind his back? And why, according to the account, had the most important preparation apparently been underway before Charles knew there was anything to prepare for? Hi, viewers. If you were Charles and discovered that a plan affecting your own future had allegedly been prepared without your knowledge, would you confront everyone involved or stay silent to protect the family? Leave your answer in the comments, because that simple choice says a lot about what you believe matters more, the truth or the peace. And before this story goes any further, take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who follows the royal family. If the idea of someone being kept in the dark about decisions affecting their own life makes you uncomfortable, then doing nothing is exactly how secrets survive. A like, a share, and a subscription may seem small, but they are also a way of saying that questions deserve answers.
A recent poll revealed only 14% of Brits support Camilla being called Queen, with her overall support wilting behind all royals except Princess Eugenie and Beatrice, disgraced Prince Andrew, and treacherous Prince Harry.
The judge had not yet finished. A second page was brought into view. This was where the atmosphere reportedly changed. The first document could still be explained away as ordinary contingency planning. Royal households, like governments and major institutions, prepare for uncertainty. Responsibilities can change, health can change, circumstances can change. None of that, by itself, proves wrongdoing. But the second document allegedly contained language that went further. It appeared to deal not simply with what would happen if Charles became temporarily unable to perform certain duties, but with how influence and responsibilities might be reorganized around that possibility. That distinction was everything. The difference between preparing for a crisis and preparing for a different balance of power can be only a few lines on paper. Yet those lines can change the meaning of every conversation that came before them. Charles reportedly leaned forward. He was no longer watching the judge alone. His attention moved between the document and the people seated behind it. The silence around him carried its own weight. Every face seemed suddenly important. Every advisor who had ever told him that there was nothing unusual happening could now be remembered differently. Then came the detail that reportedly unsettled him most: the date. It was earlier than expected, much earlier. According to the account, the document was prepared before Charles had been informed of the discussions it appeared to anticipate. That did not prove that Camilla had intended to remove him from authority. It did not prove that a secret plot existed, but it raised a question that was far harder to dismiss. Why would preparations concerning Charles's own position exist without Charles being fully aware of them? The judge reportedly returned to that question in careful language. There was no theatrical accusation, no declaration of guilt. Instead, the documents were examined one by one, and the timeline began to form. a financial record, a confidential exchange, a discussion concerning responsibilities. Then another reference to what might happen if Charles's position became unstable.
Well, Dan, I think it was very well timed that you should mention those polls, that only 14% are happy with Camilla being called Queen. There may be lots of reasons for that, but there's no doubt that Diana herself recognized that she would probably never be.
Individually, each piece could appear harmless. Together, they look different. That was the first real fracture. For Charles, the uncertainty was more painful than a direct accusation might have been. An accusation can be answered, a document can be challenged, a witness can be questioned. But a pattern forces a person to revisit the past. It makes ordinary moments feel suspicious. A meeting that once seemed routine can suddenly look like preparation. A conversation that once sounded reassuring can acquire another meaning. That was the psychological pressure building inside the room. Charles was not simply hearing what the documents allegedly contained, he was being pushed to reconsider what he thought he already knew. Not a shouting match, not a public confrontation, not some spectacular scene outside palace gates. Something quieter. Charles was being forced to consider the possibility that people around him had been preparing for circumstances he had not known were being discussed. And that possibility had a deeply personal edge. Because contingency planning is one thing when everyone understands the rules. It becomes something else when the person whose future is being planned is apparently the last person to hear about it. The judge then reached the portion of the evidence that reportedly connected the financial records to the confidential correspondence. This was the moment the story became harder to contain. The records allegedly suggested that preparations were not confined to a single conversation or one isolated concern. There appeared to be a sequence. Discussions led to documents. Documents led to financial arrangements. Financial arrangements appeared connected to questions of responsibility and authority. A pattern was beginning to emerge, or at least that was the concern raised by the account. Charles had spent years living inside a system where information was carefully managed. Every decision carried consequences. Every private conversation could eventually become public. Yet now the problem was not that too much information had escaped. It was that something important may have been kept from him. He reportedly asked for clarification. The answer did not settle the matter. Instead, it introduced another name into the chain of decisions: Camilla. That was when the emotional center of the story shifted. This was no longer simply about palace paperwork, it was about trust. The allegations surrounding the documents suggested that Camilla had been involved in discussions about how responsibilities might be handled under a future set of circumstances. The crucial issue was not whether she had a legitimate reason to think about the monarchy's stability. She could have believed she was protecting the institution. The troubling question was whether Charles had been given the full picture. And if he had not, who decided he did not need to know? And there was another problem. If the planning had truly been motivated by concern for the monarchy, then the explanation should have been straightforward. If it had been motivated by personal ambition, the implications were much darker. The evidence, as described in the account, had not yet answered that question. It had only made the question impossible to avoid. That uncertainty was now hanging over everyone in the room, and it was about to become even more dangerous. The judge reportedly returned to the first document, then to the date, then to the later correspondence. The sequence mattered. One document could be dismissed as planning. Two could be coincidence. Several connected documents were different. They created a timeline, and once a timeline exists, every earlier conversation can take on a new meaning. That is where Charles's world reportedly began to fracture. Not because the judge had declared Camilla guilty of anything, not because the documents automatically proved a secret scheme, but because the possibility itself had become impossible to ignore. Somewhere in the background, according to the account, preparations had allegedly been taking shape for a future in which Charles's authority could become uncertain. And the most disturbing part was still waiting. The judge had one more document. It was not the oldest document. It was not the longest. It was simply the one that reportedly contained the clearest indication of what the planning was actually meant to accomplish.
I mean, Madonna has been absolutely wonderful with all these charities and takes a huge interest. So they were all telling me anyway about what a difference she makes. And I know how seriously she takes it all. But she does have a wonderful way with people, you see. That's the special thing, I think.
The room fell silent again. Charles looked toward the bench. The judge placed a hand over the final page, and then the final page. Then the judge reportedly said that before examining its contents, the court needed to understand one thing. The plan had not begun when Charles's situation became unstable. It had allegedly begun before that. Much earlier, and that meant the question was no longer merely what Camilla had been preparing for. The question was whether someone had already been preparing for a future Charles himself had never agreed to. That was the moment the story moved from suspicion to something far more personal. The final page remained beneath the judge's hand. For a moment, nobody seemed willing to move. Charles had already heard enough to understand that the earlier documents were not isolated pieces of paperwork. They appeared to form a sequence, but the sequence still had an escape route. There was still a possibility that the entire matter had been misunderstood, that advisors had been preparing for an unlikely crisis, that Camilla's involvement had been motivated by nothing more sinister than institutional caution. Then the judge turned the page. The document reportedly began with language that sounded almost ordinary. It referred to continuity, responsibilities, and the need for stability if circumstances changed. Nothing in those opening lines would have been enough to justify the growing tension inside the room. Then came the section that reportedly caught everyone's attention. It concerned who would exercise influence if Charles became unable to carry out certain responsibilities. That was different. The issue was no longer simply what would happen to the monarchy during a crisis. It was who would be positioned to shape what came afterward. Charles reportedly stared at the page for several seconds. The expression on his face was difficult to read. There was no dramatic outburst, no raised voice. The reaction was quieter than that. His eyes remained fixed ahead while the meaning of the document appeared to settle in stages. First came confusion, then recognition, then the unmistakable discomfort of someone realizing that a conversation had been taking place somewhere else. According to the account, the document appeared to describe a framework in which certain royal responsibilities could be redistributed under specific circumstances. The details were reportedly connected to financial arrangements and private discussions involving people close to the royal household. That alone did not establish a secret attempt to remove Charles. It did, however, raise an uncomfortable possibility. Why had nobody presented this framework to him? The question hung over the proceedings, and the deeper the judge reportedly went into the documents, the harder it became to separate one issue from another. A financial entry appeared to correspond with a discussion. The discussion appeared to correspond with a later communication. That communication appeared to anticipate circumstances that had not yet happened. It was the timeline that made the material so unsettling. The planning seemed to look forward, but some of the preparations allegedly existed before the circumstances they were supposedly designed to address. That detail changed the atmosphere again. Charles had spent his life being prepared for uncertainty. His position demanded it. Illness, constitutional questions, succession, public crises, family disputes, and political pressure could all affect the institution around him. Preparation itself was not suspicious. Secrecy was the issue. If everyone had known about the contingency planning, there would have been little mystery. If Charles had approved it, the documents would have carried a completely different meaning. But according to the narrative surrounding the evidence, Charles had not been given the full picture. That was the allegation. And it was precisely why the judge's examination mattered. The court was not merely looking at what had been written, it was examining why it had been written, when it had been written, and who had been expected to know about it. Those three questions turned ordinary paperwork into something much more volatile.
It's a side that doesn't always come across on television, but it's It's pretty powerful in real life, isn't it?
Yes, it's a peculiar thing, sometimes the camera, but also, inevitably, you could be perhaps a bit more relaxed when you're meeting people without being totally surrounded all the time.
The judge reportedly asked for clarification about the purpose of the arrangements. There was an answer, then another question. The answer became less direct. Another document was introduced. This one allegedly contained references to how certain responsibilities could be handled if Charles's position became unstable. The phrase sounded harmless until the context was considered. What did unstable mean? Temporary illness? A constitutional problem? A personal crisis? A period when Charles could no longer perform his duties? Or something more permanent? The documents reportedly did not provide one simple answer. That ambiguity was part of the problem. It allowed competing interpretations to survive. Supporters of Camilla could argue that responsible people had to prepare for every possibility. Critics could argue that preparation was too detailed to be dismissed as routine. Charles was caught between those interpretations. He was not simply confronting a question about Camilla. He was confronting the possibility that people close to him had been thinking about his vulnerability as an institutional problem before he had even understood himself to be facing one. That thought could change the way a person remembers everything. A private conversation from months earlier, a meeting that ended too quickly, an advisor who suddenly changed the subject, a decision that seemed strangely complicated, a document that had never been shown to him. None of those things proved anything, but together they could create doubt, and doubt is often more corrosive than certainty. The judge reportedly continued through the correspondence. Some of it concerned money, some concerned responsibilities, some appeared to deal with family influence. The connections were not presented as a single explicit declaration of intent. They emerged gradually. That made the story more disturbing. There was no simple sentence saying what the entire plan was supposed to accomplish. Instead, there were fragments, pieces, references, preparations, dates, names. And the more those pieces were placed beside one another, the more difficult it became to dismiss the possibility that they belonged to the same larger strategy. Then the judge reportedly focused on one particular phrase. It concerned the future direction of royal responsibilities. The wording was cautious, almost deliberately cautious, but its implication was difficult to miss. There appeared to be an assumption that certain responsibilities could be shifted if Charles's circumstances changed. That assumption raised a new question. Who had decided what the monarchy would need if Charles could not continue as expected? And why had that decision apparently been discussed without him? Charles reportedly looked toward those advising him. This time, there was no immediate reassurance. That silence mattered, because the most damaging discoveries are not always made when someone says something shocking. Sometimes they are made when nobody says anything at all. The account describes Charles as increasingly withdrawn as the examination continued. His attention remained fixed on the proceedings, but the earlier expectation that someone would explain everything seemed to disappear. He was now listening differently. Not as a king receiving information, as a man searching for the missing piece. Then another correspondence was introduced. It allegedly suggested that the planning had been discussed in stages. That meant the issue might not have been one private decision made on one afternoon. There may have been an evolution. First, concern, then preparation, then financial consideration, then discussion of responsibilities, then consideration of how those responsibilities could operate if Charles became unable to control them in the usual way. If that sequence was accurate, the significance was enormous, because it suggested that the plan had developed over time, and plans that develop over time usually involve more than one person. That was the question nobody in the room seemed eager to confront. Who else knew? The possibility of additional knowledge changed the stakes immediately. If Camilla alone had been considering contingencies, the matter could potentially be explained as a private concern. If advisors had known, the issue became institutional. If financial personnel had known, the issue became administrative. If several people had known while Charles remained unaware, the issue became something much more serious. The judge reportedly appeared to recognize the distinction. The examination shifted toward the people surrounding the documents. Not just who wrote them, who received them, who responded, who acted on them, who authorized the financial movements, who knew the discussions were happening, and perhaps most importantly, who decided Charles did not need to know. That final question reportedly struck at the heart of the matter, because there is a profound difference between being protected from unnecessary information and being excluded from information about your own future. Charles had spent decades carrying responsibility for an institution larger than any individual member of the family. If the documents really did describe preparations affecting that institution without his knowledge, then the emotional injury would not simply come from Camilla. It would come from the system surrounding him. That was when the story took another turn. The documents allegedly revealed that the financial preparations were not entirely separate from the discussions about responsibility. There appeared to be a relationship between them. Money was not necessarily being moved for some hidden personal purpose. The account does not establish that. The significance was that financial planning could determine what became possible later. Who controls resources can influence who controls decisions. And suddenly the documents looked less like passive preparation and more like the groundwork for a future arrangement. Still, one question remained unanswered. What exactly was that future supposed to look like? The judge reportedly knew that the next document could clarify it. Charles knew it too. The room had become almost unnaturally quiet. Then the judge reached for another file. This time, the document reportedly contained correspondence directly connected to Camilla's planning. The earlier records had shown preparation. The financial material had shown structure. Now there was a chance to understand intention, and that was the part Charles had reportedly feared most, because there is a difference between discovering that someone prepared for your weakness and discovering what they intended to do with the power that might become available. The next page was opened. Charles looked down, then he looked up, and for the first time, according to the account, the uncertainty on his face appeared to give way to something more personal. He had recognized the significance of what he was about to hear. The judge began reading. The wording was careful. The implications were not. The correspondence appeared to contemplate a future in which Charles would not necessarily control the direction of certain royal responsibilities. That single revelation transformed the question. It was no longer simply about contingency planning, it was about influence. It was about who would stand closest to the center if Charles were pushed away from it, and if that was truly what the documents suggested, then one final mystery remained. Camilla could not have prepared for that future alone. Someone had to know, someone had to discuss it, someone had to believe it was possible. And somewhere in the correspondence, according to the account, there was reportedly a clue pointing toward exactly who those people might have been. The judge turned to the next page. Charles did not look away. This time, there would be no easy explanation. The next page contained the clue everyone had been looking for. The judge reportedly paused before reading it, as though the wording required more care than the documents that had come before. Charles remained motionless. The room had already heard about financial preparations, private correspondence, and possible changes to royal responsibilities. But this document allegedly did something different. It connected the planning to a specific future scenario, and that scenario involved Charles, not as the person directing the response, as the person whose position might have to be worked around. The distinction was devastating. Until that moment, there had always been room for another explanation. Contingency planning could be defended. Financial preparation could be defended. Private discussions between senior members of the royal household could be defended. But the closer the documents were examined, the more the same question returned. Why was Charles apparently outside the conversation? The judge reportedly read the relevant sections slowly. The language was restrained, almost bureaucratic. There was no dramatic declaration of betrayal, no sentence openly announcing an intention to remove Charles from power. Instead, there were references to continuity, delegation, responsibility, authority, and the possibility that circumstances could require a different arrangement. Those words sounded harmless until placed beside the earlier documents. Then they became something else, a framework. a framework for what might happen if Charles could no longer operate in the way everyone expected. That was when the alleged planning began to look less like a collection of precautions and more like a sequence. The first document established the concern. The second established the financial preparation. The third appeared to consider responsibilities. And now this document appeared to contemplate the structure that could exist afterward. The judge reportedly asked whether Charles had been informed when these discussions began. There was hesitation. That hesitation was enough to change the temperature of the room. Charles reportedly turned toward the people behind him. He was looking for an explanation. None came quickly. For someone accustomed to receiving briefings, this was perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire episode. A lack of information can be frightening, but discovering that others may have possessed information that was deliberately or inadvertently withheld is something deeper. It forces a person to ask what else they might not know. Charles's position made that question even more painful. His entire public life had been built around continuity. The monarchy was supposed to survive individual personalities. Institutions were supposed to outlast private disagreements. Decisions affecting the crown were supposed to follow established channels. Yet the accounts surrounding these documents suggested that something had happened behind those channels. Something private. Something that had apparently developed before Charles understood its existence. The judge reportedly returned to the date. That date had become the quiet center of the entire proceeding. It showed that the alleged preparation began earlier than the moment when Charles's circumstances were publicly understood to have become uncertain. That did not prove malicious intent, but it raised a troubling possibility. Perhaps the people involved had been preparing for a risk they believed was coming. If so, why had Charles not been told? That question could not be answered by pointing to routine contingency planning. It demanded something more. It demanded an explanation of motive. And motive was precisely what the documents did not state directly. This made the story more complicated, not less. There were at least two possible interpretations. The first was that Camilla and her advisors had been trying to protect the monarchy from instability. If they believed circumstances could change quickly, they may have wanted arrangements ready before a crisis arrived. The second interpretation was far more damaging. Perhaps the preparations reflected an expectation that Charles would eventually become less central to the operation of the monarchy, and those around him were quietly preparing for that possibility before he had accepted it himself. The documents, as described in the account, did not provide a simple answer. That uncertainty became the source of the tension, because viewers were no longer waiting for a villain to be exposed. They were waiting to discover which explanation survived the evidence. Then another piece of correspondence reportedly appeared. It was shorter than the others, but its timing was significant. It allegedly referred to the need for a controlled transition if circumstances demanded one. Transition. That word changed everything. A transition from what? And to what? The judge reportedly asked for the surrounding correspondence. More pages were produced. Charles watched as the papers were placed before the court. The sequence now seemed to stretch across multiple discussions. One conversation appeared to lead to another. One decision appeared to anticipate another. And behind all of it was the same unresolved issue. Charles had allegedly not been fully informed. The psychological effect of such a discovery can be profound. It is not simply anger. Anger gives a person something to fight. Betrayal creates something harder to escape. It creates doubt. Charles could challenge a specific document. He could question a specific advisor. He could ask Camilla directly what she had intended. But how could he know whether the explanation he received was complete? That was the question beginning to take hold. And it was not only about Camilla anymore. The circle was widening. The judge reportedly began examining who had access to the correspondence, who had received copies, who had discussed the financial arrangements, who had been involved in preparing the proposed framework. The names mattered because every additional person who appeared to know about the planning increased the significance of Charles's alleged exclusion. If one person had acted privately, it might be personal. If several people had coordinated, it could become institutional. That distinction hung over the proceedings. Then came another unexpected detail. The alleged planning appeared to involve not just what would happen to responsibilities, but how those responsibilities would be perceived. Public stability, institutional continuity, control of messaging. The implication was subtle. Whoever shaped the structure would also have influence over how the transition was understood. And suddenly, the financial documents seemed less important than they had at first. Money could fund a plan. Responsibilities could define a plan. But perception could determine whether the public accepted it. That was where the alleged correspondence became especially sensitive. If the monarchy were ever placed under pressure, the person controlling the narrative could influence how every decision was interpreted. Was Charles stepping back voluntarily? Was he temporarily unable to act? Was he being protected? Was the institution simply adapting? Those distinctions mattered enormously, and if preparations had been made in advance, then someone had already been thinking about those questions. The judge reportedly focused on this aspect. The court was not simply examining whether contingency planning had occurred, it was examining whether the planning revealed an expectation about Charles's future role. That was a much more serious question. Charles reportedly remained silent. The image was not one of fury, it was something more uncomfortable. A man listening to a version of his own future that other people may have been discussing before he had agreed to it. Then came the question that reportedly made the room go still. If the planning was legitimate, why had it not been disclosed to Charles? No immediate answer resolved the issue. And that silence carried more weight than any accusation, because sometimes the most damaging part of a secret is not what it contains, it is the reason someone believed it had to remain a secret. The account suggests that Charles began to understand that the documents might not have been designed around one sudden crisis. They may have represented preparation for a longer period of uncertainty. That would mean the date mattered even more. It would mean the planning allegedly began when there was no immediate public reason to expect such a dramatic change. So what had those involved seen? What had they feared? What did they know that Charles allegedly did not? The judge reportedly moved to another section of the evidence. This time, the correspondence appeared to concern the balance between family influence and institutional responsibility. That distinction was crucial. The monarchy is an institution, but its decisions are made by people, and when family relationships become entangled with institutional power, private motives can become impossible to separate from public consequences. That was the tension surrounding Camilla's alleged planning. Perhaps she believed she was protecting Charles, perhaps she believed she was protecting the monarchy, perhaps she believed both were the same thing, but if the planning genuinely contemplated a future in which Charles's authority was reduced, then the question of intent became unavoidable. Was she preparing for something she feared, or preparing for something she expected? The answer was still hidden, and then the judge reportedly revealed something even more troubling. The correspondence did not appear to begin with the question of what should happen to Charles. It appeared to begin with the question of what should happen if Charles's circumstances changed. That subtle difference mattered. It suggested that the possibility had already been placed on the table. Someone had imagined it. Someone had discussed it. Someone had prepared for it. And someone had apparently decided that Charles did not need to be part of that conversation at the time. That was the point at which the story stopped being merely about documents. It became about trust. The trust between a husband and wife. The trust between a monarch and his advisors. And the trust between Charles and the institution he had spent his entire life preparing to serve. For the first time, the possibility emerged that the person closest to him may have been preparing for a future that Charles had never been shown. That was the allegation. That was the suspicion. And that was why the next document mattered so much. Because according to the account, it contained something the earlier papers did not. A reference to what would happen after the transition. Not merely who would assume responsibility, not merely how finances would be handled, but who would hold influence once the new arrangement was in place. The judge reportedly looked at the page for several seconds. Then the judge looked toward Charles. The document was finally about to answer the question that had been hanging over the entire proceeding. What was Camilla actually preparing for? The answer, according to the account, was far more extensive than anyone had initially believed. And if the wording was interpreted correctly, the planning did not simply imagine Charles becoming vulnerable. It imagined a future in which other people could be positioned to make decisions around him. That was the detail that reportedly shattered the remaining certainty. Because Charles could understand preparing for illness. He could understand preparing for constitutional difficulty. He could even understand preparing for an unexpected crisis. What he could not easily understand was why someone would prepare for his diminished influence without telling him. The judge reportedly turned another page. This time, there was no ambiguity about the date. It was unmistakably earlier than Charles had been led to believe. And suddenly the entire timeline had to be reconsidered. The planning had allegedly started before the crisis, before the public knew there was a crisis, before Charles himself understood that there was anything unusual to prepare for. The room had reached the point where one question dominated everything else. Who knew first? Because whoever knew first may have known something Charles did not. And that was the mystery the next document was about to expose. The judge finally reached the document that could answer the question nobody in the room had been able to escape. Who knew first? The page was reportedly brief. There was no sprawling explanation, no dramatic confession, no single sentence that could settle every suspicion. Instead, it contained references to discussions, responsibilities, and preparations that appeared to have been taking shape long before Charles was aware of them. And then came the detail that changed the meaning of the entire timeline. Someone had apparently been thinking about the future arrangement before Charles had been brought into the conversation. The judge reportedly made the distinction carefully. The document did not, by itself, prove that Camilla intended to remove Charles from authority. It did not prove that a coordinated scheme existed. But it allegedly demonstrated that discussions about a possible restructuring had taken place, and that those discussions appeared to involve people beyond a single private conversation. That was enough to leave Charles facing a question far more painful than the one he had entered the proceeding with. Was he the person being protected from a crisis? Or was he the person being planned around? The difference was enormous. If Camilla had been preparing for the possibility that Charles might become unable to perform his responsibilities, then her actions could be interpreted as an attempt to protect the monarchy from uncertainty. But if the planning had gone beyond that, if it had considered how influence could be redistributed while Charles remained present, then the issue became deeply personal. Charles reportedly sat quietly as the implications were explained. The room was no longer waiting for another shocking phrase. Everyone was trying to understand the same thing. How long had this been happening? That question led back to the dates. The earliest document appeared to precede the later discussions. The later discussions appeared to connect with the financial records. The financial records appeared to support preparations for a possible change in responsibilities. The pieces were not necessarily proof of one hidden master plan, but they formed a pattern. And patterns are dangerous because they force people to reconsider isolated events. A conversation can be innocent, a financial arrangement can be routine, a contingency plan can be responsible, a private meeting can be nothing. But place them together, in the right sequence, and suddenly the story changes. That was reportedly what happened to Charles. The past began looking different. Meetings that had seemed insignificant could now feel loaded. Explanations that had once seemed complete suddenly appeared incomplete. The people around him were no longer simply advisors and family members. They were people whose knowledge had to be questioned, and Camilla stood at the center of that uncertainty. There was still no definitive proof of malicious intent. That mattered. The allegations could not simply be transformed into established fact because the documents appeared troubling. Yet the damage to trust did not require a criminal verdict. Trust can fracture long before a court reaches a conclusion. For Charles, the most difficult question may not have been whether Camilla had done something unlawful. It may have been whether she had made decisions about his future without believing he deserved to know. That is a different kind of wound. It reaches beyond law. It reaches into marriage, into loyalty, into the private understanding between two people who are supposed to face uncertainty together. The judge reportedly continued examining the evidence, but the atmosphere had changed. The central mystery was no longer hidden. There had been planning. There had been discussions. There had been financial considerations, and there had been a period during which Charles was allegedly not fully aware of the extent of them. What remained uncertain was motive. That uncertainty became the final battleground. One interpretation suggested Camilla had been acting defensively. Perhaps she believed Charles's position could become unstable and wanted the institution prepared before events forced decisions upon it. Another interpretation suggested something more calculated. Perhaps she believed the monarchy needed a different balance of influence. Perhaps she believed certain responsibilities would eventually have to move away from Charles. Perhaps she had simply prepared for a possibility that Charles himself had refused to contemplate. The evidence, as described in the account, could support questions. It could not automatically answer them. And that was precisely why the story became so compelling. There was no neat ending, no simple villain, no convenient confession. Instead, there was a king sitting with the realization that the people closest to him may have been discussing his future without him. Then came the palace reaction. Behind closed doors, the concern was reportedly less about public embarrassment than institutional damage. A palace cannot function on suspicion. It requires trust. Advisors have to know who is making decisions. Family members have to know where authority begins and ends. Financial arrangements have to be explainable. Contingency plans have to have clear boundaries. If those boundaries become blurred, every decision can become a source of suspicion. That was the danger facing Charles. If he confronted Camilla publicly, the private disagreement could become an institutional crisis. If he remained silent, questions about what he knew and when he knew it could continue to grow. If he demanded a complete explanation, people who had been involved in the planning might be forced to reveal what they had discussed. And if those discussions involved more people than initially suspected, the consequences could spread through the palace. Charles therefore faced a choice that had no painless outcome: protect the institution or protect the truth. The irony was difficult to escape. A system built around continuity was now facing uncertainty because of questions about continuity. A family that had spent generations protecting private matters was confronting a dispute in which secrecy itself had become the central issue. And a king who had spent his entire life preparing for responsibility was reportedly being forced to ask whether others had been preparing for the possibility that he might not exercise it. That is why the alleged date mattered so much. Not because a date proves intent, it doesn't, but because timing can reveal what people were thinking before events became public. If the preparations truly began before Charles knew they existed, then someone had anticipated a possibility that he had not been told to anticipate. The question becomes unavoidable. What did they see coming? Was there information Charles did not have? Was there concern about his health, his position, the institution, or something else entirely? Or was this simply the kind of contingency planning that becomes suspicious only when viewed backward? Those questions remain at the heart of the account, and perhaps that is what makes the alleged revelation so damaging. It does not end with a clear answer. It creates dozens of them. For Charles, however, one answer may have become clear. He could no longer assume that every conversation involving his future had included him. That realization can alter a relationship more profoundly than an argument ever could, because an argument happens in the open. A secret plan happens somewhere else, and discovering that something was happening somewhere else forces a person to wonder how many other things they never saw. That is where the story leaves Charles. Not defeated, not publicly destroyed, but changed. The king now has to decide what matters more: the appearance of unity, or the certainty of knowing exactly what was being planned. And Camilla faces the same problem from the opposite side. If the planning was innocent, she would have to explain why it was kept so private. If it was necessary, she would have to explain why Charles was allegedly not fully informed. If the documents have been misunderstood, the misunderstanding would need to be resolved. And if the evidence eventually proves more extensive than the account suggests, then the consequences could reach far beyond one marriage. Because this was never only about Camilla. It was about power. It was about trust. It was about what happens when private family decisions begin touching the machinery of a monarchy. Most importantly, it was about Charles discovering that the future of his own position may have been discussed before he knew there was a future to discuss. And that leaves one final question. If Camilla truly believed she was protecting the monarchy, why was Charles allegedly kept outside the conversation? If she believed she was protecting Charles himself, why were the preparations reportedly so extensive? And if neither explanation tells the whole story, then what was the real purpose behind the planning? Those are the questions that remain, not because every allegation has been proven, not because every document automatically means what critics claim it means, but because once the timeline exists, the questions cannot simply disappear. The most powerful institutions in the world can survive criticism. They can survive gossip. They can survive public disagreement. What they struggle to survive is a collapse of trust among the people expected to protect them. For Charles, that may ultimately be the real damage. Not the embarrassment, not the headlines, not even the possibility of a palace controversy. It is the possibility that someone close to him was preparing for a future he had never agreed to, while he continued believing that the people around him were preparing that future with him. And if that possibility is true, then the judge did not simply reveal what Camilla had allegedly been planning. The judge revealed the question Charles may now have to live with. Who was planning his future? And why was the king the last person to know? If this story made you question how much powerful people can hide behind closed doors, subscribe and stay with this channel. And if you believe Charles deserves the full truth before anyone asks him to protect the institution again, leave a comment saying, "Tell Charles the truth." Share this story with someone who follows the royal family, because silence allows unanswered questions to disappear, while speaking up keeps them alive. In the end, the documents may never tell the entire story, but they have already created the one question nobody can easily put back into the folder. What was Camilla really preparing for behind Charles's back?